Huessy seminar. If it's your first time here, we are happy you made it and will help you return for more of these conversations on deterrence. Welcome to the NIDS President James Pertosky, and to our regulars, welcome back, and thank you for being a part of NIDS and Peter Huessy seminars. We are especially pleased today to have Ambassador Christopher Ford with us. My name is Alex Littlefield. I'm a Chief of Staff and Fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS for short. And thank you all for being here today. NIDS is a 501c3 think tank. Our motto is Think Deterrence. We are laser focused on the theme of deterrence, which is another way of saying peace through strength. And we promote this perspective through our weekly podcast, the NIDS View and NIDS Knowledge, our journal Global Security Review, and our NIDS Academy. And we also have in-person events in the nation's capital and other locations. During our Q&A, you are welcome to put those in the chat box, or you can hit the raise your hand icon, and I will know that means you would like the camera and microphone so that you can interact directly with our speaker, which is one of the unique things about our seminars here, is allows for direct interaction between audience and speaker. Now, we're all very happy to have Senior Fellow Peter Huessy as a key part of our organization, and he's been hosting these seminars for 40 years. Peter brings a wealth of knowledge, connections, and insight to our organization. And I would encourage everyone to post your questions and get ready for a lively discussion. Now, Peter will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Alex. I want to welcome everybody to this event, and in particular our speaker, Dr. Christopher Ford. I do want to mention a couple of things. We're going to hear from Brad Roberts next Friday. We're also, Steve Blank and I published this morning an article on Gatestone, and it had to do with Mr. Zeliko's challenge to us that we may finish the modernization of our nuclear forces and of our conventional forces, cyber and space, 10 years hence, and therefore in the interim.
There are all kinds of storms in the DC area this morning. I hope that's not causing trouble for us.
Yeah, it is real stormy and rainy. Yeah, Chris, so we have your report. It's been uploaded. The link has been uploaded to the chat for anyone in the audience who would like to see the report. It's from the National Institute for Public Policy, or NIP, and we're going to hear from Ambassador Ford on his research. So over to you, Ambassador Ford.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks, Peter, if you can still hear me. And thanks to NIDS for having me. This is great. I'm really pleased to be able to say a few words, at least about my take on China's current nuclear weapons buildup and the things that might perhaps lie behind it, based upon the paper that you referenced. So thanks for flagging that in the link to this event. Obviously, as I'm obliged to say, these are of course only my personal opinions. You shouldn't mistake these remarks as representing necessarily representing the views of anybody else. But it's a great topic, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you guys. So, I, as a sort of a WMD guy over much of my career, I've found China's stunning nuclear expansion right now not just alarming, but actually intellectually fascinating. One of the more interesting aspects of the growing Chinese threat that we face, because after all, it was for decades both the claim of Chinese Communist Party propagandists and also the view of, I would say, probably most international observers, that China was somehow different than other nuclear-armed states by virtue of its so-called minimalist approach to deterrence, its small nuclear arsenal, and its so-called no first use, or NFU, declaratory policy, and its much ballyhooed apparent disinterest in arms racing. So that was sort of, in some ways, at least, if you believe the branding, a distinguishing feature of China's approach to nuclear weapons. And yet, here we are today, right? So that is why I find this particular wrinkle so interesting. It's pretty clear that China has abandoned what Deng Xiaoping used to call the strategy of biding time and hiding capabilities. And it's quite clear that this kind of, the kind of seemingly benign nuclear weapons policies of yesteryear have also now been thrown overboard, along with that strategic restraint. So, I mean, I would say it's even quite possible that the minimum deterrence approach of yesteryear was always merely a temporary expedient, or perhaps even a smokescreen, part of a campaign of strategic misdirection to lull the rest of the world into complacency while the PRC built up other facets of its power until such point that Beijing could engage with relative impunity in a massive nuclear expansion that was perhaps always at some point going to be part of China's national rejuvenation. But in making that point, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So what I'd like to do a little bit is circle back, and as those of you who may have seen the paper already that was referred to, in that paper, I tried to refer last February I tried to offer sort of an organizing framework, a way to sort of think about trying to how to contemplate PRC nuclear weapons policy in a sort of a structured way, and try to understand and draw things out about it. And what I did in that paper is suggest suggested a prism of three particular historical eras through which Chinese nuclear policy has arguably progressed, and four conceptual framings. So 3 eras and 4 framings. That's a very Chinese way to describe things in some ways. So my 3 eras of Chinese nuclear policy correspond loosely to, number 1, the early period of nuclear weaponization under Mao Zedong, sort of the formative years, if you will. Number 2, the period of so-called minimum deterrence, which I sort of referred to before, which stretches from Mao's late years until relatively recently. And then number 3, the national rejuvenation period, if you want to call it that, that one could say began under Hu Jintao and has been accelerating under Xi Jinping, and in which China's nuclear capabilities have been expanding really very, very rapidly. So those are the 3 eras. Now, the 4 framings that I offered in the paper, that was a way to sort of identify some dynamics that may help explain at least something at some point about PRC nuclear strategy and policy. These are not necessarily alternative explanations, these framings, because they aren't really mutually exclusive. And it may be that each of them reveals something noteworthy about Chinese policy to some extent. So the 4 framings are as follows. Number 1, moralistic posturing, in which nuclear weapons policy is depicted by Chinese officials as demonstrating something about Beijing's supposed moral superiority to its antagonists and to its rivals in the global security environment. The second framing is game theoretical posturing, in which Chinese strategists seek to match their nuclear force posture in some relatively clear and articulable way to some threat that they claim to fear, or perhaps in order to achieve some objective that they prioritize. That kind of game theoretical way is the way that we normally in the West think about nuclear policy, and we should be open to the idea that in some fashion it shapes Chinese thinking as well. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. The third framing, I couldn't come up with a good term for it, but I call it net power aggregation. It's not catchy, I know, but this refers to a dynamic in which Chinese officials seem to view nuclear weapons as part of their nation's overall national power in some kind of an aggregative way, and a key to its success, both in overall geopolitical competition and, if necessary, in actual warfighting. So it's kind of a big aggregation of power to which nuclear weaponry contributes in some fashion. And the fourth and final framing, I should say, has to do with great power status seeking, in which nuclear weaponry is seen as one of the indicia of global power and status that it would be intolerable for a rejuvenated China not to possess, right? So those 4 factors are what I suggest, at least as framings through which to try to think about Chinese policy over the years. So let me describe each of the 3 eras and then explain how I tried in my paper to use those 4 framings to conceptualize influences that may have helped shape Chinese policy, and then draw out some of the implications of this. So era number 1, right? So the weaponization period, right? China tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964, of course, but it's worth stressing that the road to that weaponization was anything but smooth. And a very important factor from the beginning was foreign technology transfer, these transfers were critical to the PRC's bomb program. And in that respect, China's main, if you will, pro-proliferation facilitator was the Soviet Union. In those days, before they split, before the Sino-Soviet split, Moscow agreed to provide, quote, full assistance in the fields of nuclear physics and the peaceful uses of atomic energy, close quote. But there was more than that. Chinese nuclear scientists were sent to the USSR to train, and Moscow helped the PRC in its early development of nuclear technology. And then beyond that, in 1957, the Soviets agreed to provide a ballistic missile to China, as well as technical details on nuclear weaponry and even an actual prototype nuclear weapon. They sent a team to Beijing specifically to tell China how to make nuclear weapons, and Soviet scientists helped build the Chinese nuclear weapons development facility at Haiyan, apparently constructing it as an exact replica of the Soviets' own nuclear weapons development closed city of Arzamas-16, which is now known as Sarov and is still very important in the Russian program. Now, this didn't all go smoothly, however, for China, because as we all know, the Soviets soon got cold feet as their overall relationship with the PRC soured. Lots of problems went into that, of course. Things arose out of disputes and rivalries within the communist bloc, centered upon China's discomfiture at being sort of second fiddle to anybody, including their big brother in the Soviet Union, but also out of Mao Zedong's sometimes shockingly cavalier attitudes towards nuclear war at a time when, well, at that point, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had begun to take a much more cautious approach in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the near catastrophe that represented. So in those years, CCP officials in China depicted Beijing's acquisition of nuclear weaponry as a noble service to mankind, because they said it would break the malign monopoly of the US and the Soviet Union, preventing the rest of the world from having to be the superpowers' quote, nuclear slaves, unquote. So in that framing, as the CCP saw it, as Mao Zedong saw it, nuclear proliferation was actually a public service. It was a great contribution, he said, to the cause of peace. So this was why Mao Zedong opposed arms control, and he even seemed comfortable with the idea of nuclear war itself. He regarded war with the capitalist states as being quite likely, even inevitable, and clearly felt that a nuclear war would be by no means an entirely bad idea. It would ensure, he suggested, the, quote, total elimination of capitalism, and thereby usher in an epoch of what he called permanent peace. According to Mao Zedong, quote, if the worst came to the worst and half of mankind died in a nuclear war, the other half would remain while imperialism would be razed to the ground and the whole world would become socialist. Now, as you might imagine, hearing Mao say those sorts of things, Nikita Khrushchev, especially not so long after Cuba, came to see Mao as basically being unhinged in this regard, concluding that Mao Zedong actually wanted a nuclear war so that both the US and the USSR would be devastated, leaving communist China in the global catbird seat. As Khrushchev put it later, everybody except Mao was thinking about how to avoid war. And Khrushchev reportedly said that Mao told one person that Mao Zedong is sick, crazy, and should be taken to an asylum. So clearly the Soviets started to think this was not such a great idea. And so despite his earlier help for Mao's nuclear weapons effort, Khrushchev held back from delivering that actual prototype bomb that I mentioned before. And in fact, by August of 1960, of course, all Soviet advisors were gone. So thanks to Soviet help, China was by that point already well along the road to weaponization. But the PRC and the USSR were thereafter bitter rivals rather than allies. So China, I mean, this is this first era. So China entered the nuclear era with a worryingly nuclear messianic reputation, and in a very firmly sort of pro-proliferation mode. And indeed, it soon sought to provide nuclear weapons help to Indonesia, although that project fell apart. But then began a much more, unfortunately, successful, long-running nuclear proliferation relationship with Pakistan. So that was the first era, and it was a dramatic one, I guess. So the second era that I referred to, that can be thought of as starting more or less when Mao passed from the scene in 1976. And it derives in large part from the fact that after Mao's death, the man who became and remained China's paramount leader throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Deng Xiaoping, he was far more pragmatic than the sort of messianic Mao had been. So Mao had attempted to build the PRC into a global revolutionary powerhouse and expected a climactic war with capitalism. But Deng Xiaoping sought to build up China's wealth and power much more peacefully through export-led growth, acquiring from the rest of the world the technological and the industrial know-how that it needed in order to grow stronger through the accumulation of what Deng's advisors came to call comprehensive national power, CNP. And CNP was viewed as kind of I alluded to this before, as an aggregation of all the myriad facets of things that could make a country powerful. Military capabilities, economic strength, technological sophistication, political influence, cultural strength and self-confidence, all these kinds of things, as a sort of a whole of which there were many components. And this CNP thinking remains a powerful concept in PRC strategic planning, I believe, to this very day. But during this period, this learning that China was felt to require to acquire the sutras of modernity from the outside world, to get strong and powerful by acquiring that kind of knowledge. That kind of learning period required that Dengist China had to maintain a fairly unprovocative geopolitical posture, at least vis-a-vis the West, for fear that alarming Chinese behavior could provoke the West to cut off those kinds of transfers of technology and industrial knowledge that Beijing needed so much. After all, as I mentioned a moment ago, intemperate behavior under Mao Zedong had helped provoke a cutoff of Soviet nuclear and other military assistance several years before Beijing actually had the bomb. So it was reasonable to think, as they did, that Deng's China might be able to avoid repeating that mistake in the new context of Western knowledge transfer by simply not talking about its ambitions or by pretending to have more modest ones than it did. And so this is the context for Deng's famous exhortation, his 24-character phrase that included the phrasing, "Bide your time and hide your capabilities." So here, Beijing was essentially explicitly building up its CNP for some time in the future when it would no longer have to hide its capabilities anymore and could act in the ways that it wished in the world, in the ways that it had impliedly always desired to do eventually. Biding time, of course, means you're, for something, for a purpose until some point, right? And that's the implied message of biding your time, and it fits very well with China's subsequent behavior. So crucially, though, for this middle period, this second era, for so long as that sort of cautious Dengism lasted, China's posture in the geopolitical arena and in the nuclear arena needed to seem unthreatening. It needed to seem focused exclusively upon economic reform and upon generally market-based, export-driven economic development. And so it was during this period in which our longstanding conventional wisdom in the West about Chinese nuclear policy developed. And it came commonly to be said that China adhered to a, quote, minimum deterrent strategy, it was said, based upon a small nuclear force, primarily for second strike retaliation, to deter aggression, and a no first use policy, an NFU policy. And indeed, for a long time, China's arsenal did remain relatively small, and it was not obviously structured for warfighting. Now, this was what China's officials told the world, such as in 2006, when its defense white paper emphasized that, and I'll quote, "China exercises great restraint in developing its nuclear force. It has never entered into and will never enter into an arms race with any other country." Right. So that was the mantra, and that is actually what international observers, looking at where China's posture was for a long time, seem generally to have believed. Now, to be sure, even in Deng's time, there were some suggestions that China regarded nuclear weapons as more than just a defensive tool. As I'll discuss more in a moment, Chinese leaders also saw nuclear weapons as a status symbol and a sign of geopolitical progress. Nuclear capabilities were part of how China could show that it had shaken off what CCP propagandists called their country's century of humiliation at Western and Japanese hands, and to show that it was regaining the Middle Kingdom's traditional place of importance in the world. And don't just take my word for it, you can take Deng Xiaoping's word for it. He once said that if it were not for the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and the satellites we have launched since the 1960s, China would not have its present international standing as a great influential country. These achievements demonstrate a nation's abilities and are a sign of its level of prosperity and development. So you can see there a hint that, by the way, this is all not just about mental deterrence, but we'll get back to that in a moment. But it was certainly true for a while that as long as China's force remained relatively small, most observers, including in the United States, seemed to believe that what the CCP mouthpiece propaganda organs said, which is that China had no threatening nuclear weapons ambitions, and that, of course, we in the West, therefore, did not need to worry much about countering its nuclear plans. But before I turn to the third era, which is the present day, let me take a quick detour, if you don't mind, into the issue of a no first use policy. I don't want to dwell too much on it here, but it must be mentioned because NFU has long been a really critical piece of PRC messaging, encouraging us to reach those very same kind of conclusions that I had just described. NFU policy is said to demonstrate the fundamentally defensive nature of nuclear weapons in PRC planning and thinking. And NFU proclamations have been really central to multilateral diplomacy by China for decades. It's actually hard to overstate how important NFU is in Chinese nuclear-related diplomacy and in the CCP regime's official image of itself. It's part of how China attempts to posture itself as being uniquely virtuous and geopolitically benevolent and non-threatening. And you may see here, of course, a prequel for my discussion in a moment of moralistic posturing, because I think this has been a very important piece of at least China's message to the world. Now, I won't go into the details because Washington's policy community these days is increasingly well aware that China's NFU policy is riddled with ambiguous caveats and is not something that one could truly rely upon in a crisis anyway, since it's really just a policy choice from which CCP leaders could depart anytime they like. Last autumn, for example, the groundbreaking report of the latest U.S. Strategic Posture Review Commission, as well as a bit before that, the U.S. Defense Department's report on Chinese military power. These both make very clear that China's NFU promise has major qualifications. And I would say that these accumulating caveats are making China's nuclear weapons declaratory policy harder and harder to distinguish at the end of the day from other countries' declaratory policies, including that of the United States. But more importantly, as I've argued for many years, NFU policies are, I would say, inherently ephemeral and unreliable. Now, in part, as I noted, this is because NFU is merely it's a non-binding promise, a policy statement that by definition could be changed on a whim anytime the CCP leadership wishes to change it. I mean, what it really means is no more than that China promises not to use nuclear weapons first until it decides to use them first. That's not a lot to work with. And I would argue that you shouldn't have confidence anyway that in a war with a geopolitical rival that was going badly, a country with nuclear weapons, whatever it had said beforehand, I think it unlikely that that country would reliably refrain from using them rather than suffer a massive defeat. So I've argued for years, including when I was in government, that in strategic terms, NFU pledges are simply pretty empty and useless. They're worth little more than the paper that they're seldom even printed upon. So, when you can really trust a country's word enough to make potentially existential national security decisions in reliance upon such a promise, when you can trust their word that much, you probably don't worry about nuclear attack from that country in the first place. On the other hand, if you distrust a country enough to worry about nuclear attack, you'd be a fool just to take it at its word. So much for the feel-good emptiness of NFU, but I did want to make sure I got that point out because I do think it's important. And you still hear the no first use narrative in Chinese nuclear posturing. So we need to have a little reality check on some of the propagandizing there. But for all of its emptiness, it was a really central piece of China's second nuclear era image in the world, the so-called minimum deterrence era, for quite a while. Anyway, so that's the second era. The third era of Chinese nuclear policy is basically today, right? And the massive nuclear expansion that is currently underway. And so since we're looking for insights into what's behind Beijing's nuclear decisions, I think it's worth stressing the context in which the buildup is occurring. And specifically, in terms of relative military capabilities, I would argue that China today faces less of a foreign military threat, relatively speaking, than it has at any time since the glory years of the Qing dynasty in the 18th century. So let me repeat that. In terms of relative capabilities, China today faces less of a foreign military threat than it has in centuries. Now, China followed its minimum deterrence approach, as we heard it described, even back when the United States and the Soviet nuclear arsenals were at their Cold War peaks, with scores of thousands of weapons between them. And this even included years in which Soviet and Chinese troops were shooting at each other in the north. And the Kremlin was considering preemptive nuclear strikes on the PRC. And yet all that while, China kept its nuclear arsenal really quite small. Now today, by contrast, China's buildup of conventional military power gives it the strongest armed forces China has had relative to the rest of the world in 2 centuries. And the potential nuclear threats, moreover, that face China, even the potential nuclear threats, they are the smallest that they have been since the early 1950s, relatively speaking, as US and Russian arsenals have been reduced to fractions of their levels at the end of the Cold War, to the point that today the US arsenal is the smallest it's been since the Eisenhower administration, back when China began its nuclear weapons proliferation collaboration effort with the Soviets. So despite all of that, despite the relative threat to China in capability terms being the smallest it's been since the Qianlong emperor was in power, China is now buying new intercontinental ballistic missiles like the proverbial sailor on shore leave orders drinks. And by the way, for the Navy guys in the audience, I mean no disrespect. I'm a former naval officer myself, but I think you'll appreciate the metaphor. Um, China is today on track to have about the same number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads as we do. That is about 1,500 or so by 2035, including those based in several hundred new missile silos. And we have no idea whether China is going to stop even there. The buildup includes, as we all know, massive new road mobile ICBMs, missiles with maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicles, an HGV equipped fractional orbital bombardment system, and new ballistic missile submarines that are capable of targeting the US homeland from bastions in the South China Sea, and a vast new nuclear weapons production infrastructure that has a throughput putting our own aging nuclear complex very much, I fear, to shame. All of which raises the obvious question, why all of this stunning and destabilizing Chinese nuclear weapons expansion, and why now? And that's where I think, at least I try to offer some ways to think about this through what I call the four framings. And just to remind you what I said before, the four framings that help us think about factors that may influence Chinese nuclear thinking. They're number one, moralistic posturing. Number two, game theoretical posturing. Number three, net power aggregation, sort of CNP kind of stuff. And number four, great power status seeking. So let me go through this quickly in turn before I conclude. So on moralistic posturing, China has, as I think you've gotten a sense already, I hope, China has clearly long made nuclear weapons policy part of broader messaging campaigns, encouraging the belief that China is a uniquely benevolent and virtuous international player whose rise nobody should fear, much less try to counter. And even, I guess, in a sense, even Mao Zedong's nuclear recklessness was profoundly moralistic in its own fashion. Remember, he portrayed China's weaponization as a noble mission and a service to the world. And of course, as we've talked about, NFU policy has been for decades a key element in China's narratives of, we are very virtuous and nobody should fear us or do anything to counter our rise. This is the kind of thing we hear from CCP propagandists, in effect, for a long time, since the beginning of the biding time and hiding capabilities era. And moralistic posturing was obviously a big piece of that. And it remains important in CCP messaging even today, even while Beijing is engaged in this massive current nuclear buildup. Now, in fairness, despite all that moralizing, there is today, at least, remarkably little moderation in Chinese nuclear behavior. I mean, it may be still significant that China doesn't even today admit to the nuclear buildup that it's doing and that everyone can see is happening. But clearly, moralistic posturing and the desire to be seen as benevolent is not preventing such a buildup. So I think of these four framings, the moralistic posturing piece is alas, the least effective and influential in terms of its shaping of current Chinese nuclear posture. So let's talk about the second framing, that is game theoretical positioning. So you could at least make an argument, if you ask me, that Chinese nuclear policy is responsive to some concept of the nuclear threats facing China. I don't think it's a very strong argument, but I at least could envision one. It's conceivable, for instance, that modern CCP leaders, especially under sort of control freak and chairman for life Xi Jinping, may be paranoid enough to believe that the malevolent foreign barbarians, that is to say us, who run Washington, might launch an out-of-the-blue first strike on China. Thereafter, relying upon the small U.S. Homeland Missile Defense System to protect us against whatever Chinese forces had survived that attack. Now, if Chinese leaders truly feared such a thing, I could at least imagine an argument that China needed more ICBM silos as the proverbial missile sink, right, to absorb incoming U.S. warheads and increase the odds of enough PRC systems surviving to overwhelm our missile defenses. So maybe you could construct a rationale for a PRC nuclear buildup on those grounds. But while I can't completely rule out that kind of game theoretical logic applying here, I don't find it very compelling. Not least, it seems unpersuasive because the scale and because the rate of China's current massive expansion of nuclear capabilities seems so very much out of line with any nuclear threat that China might reasonably feel itself to face. As I mentioned, indeed, the US nuclear arsenal, which is arguably the most acute nuclear threat to China in the present environment, that arsenal is not presently increasing at all and hasn't been. And quite the contrary, it's been shrinking for a generation. So while, moreover, while US administrations often talk a good game about expanding our missile defenses, we've done precious little to actually do that. So I'm not sure it makes sense on those grounds. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also the case that relative to the rest of the world, at least, the net military threat to China, in both conventional and in military terms, is now smaller than it's been in 200 years. It's not impossible, I suppose, that there are kind of North Korean levels of paranoid pathology in the CCP leadership, but it seems rather an extreme interpretation to suggest that China has been preemptively reacting over the last few years to a theoretical future expansion of the US nuclear capabilities that nobody in Washington has actually planned or budgeted for. If anything, I would think that kind of an argument about China's buildup would get the arrow of causality exactly backwards. In fact, if the US does finally begin expanding its arsenal in the years ahead, this will be in large part a reaction to China's buildup. So I think the game theoretical explanation for China's current spending spree of nuclear weapons binge buying, I think that is entirely unconvincing. But there is a game theoretical possibility here. I would say that if there is a game theoretical explanation for China's buildup, it lies more in perceived threats. Sorry, less in perceived threats than in perceived opportunities. That is to say, it feels to me very plausible that Beijing is engaged in its current massive buildup in order to improve what I call the offensive nuclear umbrella that strategic deterrence can create, and under which a revisionist would-be aggressor may try to carry out wars of territorial aggression. Right. So we usually think of deterrence, nuclear umbrellas, as defensive, right? Because that's how we use them. But a nuclear umbrella could also potentially be employed as an offensive weapon, in a sense, with a nuclear standoff at the strategic level, creating tactical space in which an aggressor might be able to devour regional victims without facing counter-intervention. This is what Vladimir Putin has been trying to do, I think. He's been trying to employ such an offensive nuclear umbrella by using nuclear saber rattling to scare the United States and NATO out of providing support for Ukraine as that country battles Russia's war of conquest and annexation against it. So it would not be surprising to me, to say the least, if Xi Jinping has precisely this kind of offensive umbrella in mind vis-a-vis Taiwan, and indeed, I rather fear he does. So that's the second framing. When it comes to the third framing of net power aggregation, I would say there is also some plausibility here. I think it is very, very possible that Chinese leaders do view nuclear capabilities as one element of that broader aggregation of power that they think of in talking about comprehensive national power, or CNP. It would make perfect sense under that framing to engage in a nuclear buildup, because this is one of the contributors to one's overall power, and it is one's overall power that will ultimately decide the outcomes in world historical competition. This would make sense under CNP theory, just as it would have made sense, and probably did make sense, under old Soviet era correlation of forces thinking. So as I noted earlier, this has been an important part of CCP thinking about the geopolitical environment, at least since the days of the early days of Deng Xiaoping's rule. That's when the term CNP first began to appear in party writings. And I think it's very plausible that that could be a piece of what lies behind China's nuclear buildup today. Biding your time and hiding your capabilities, as I indicated, implies that you need to avoid provocative strategic optics from a massive buildup until relatively late in the game, once your CNP has become strong enough that it will equip you to handle the consequences, such as waiting until maybe kind of about now. So that's a possibility too. Finally, fourth framing, great power status thinking. I mentioned earlier Deng Xiaoping's declaration that nuclear weapons demonstrate a nation's abilities and are a sign of its level of prosperity and development. Chinese nationalists, it's worth stressing, have long looked for indicia of geopolitical status by which to measure China's relative position and its return to the great power status of which they feel it was robbed in the 19th century. So it would surprise me not at all were modern Chinese leaders to feel, in effect, that China would be unable to feel that it had truly achieved its geopolitical return and national rejuvenation if Beijing did not possess the world's foremost nuclear arsenal. In fact, it might be almost surprising if a nuclear weapons buildup in this context did not occur sooner or later. So I think there's something to that framing as well. So where does this leave us? Well, you can sum the pieces up as much as I can, right? Of all the framings I've described, moralistic posturing would be the only one that seems to me even potentially to provide a basis for nuclear weapons restraint, and even that clearly doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. Apart from its simply not talking about the buildup that everyone can now see is in progress, restraint isn't not a word that can really be used anymore to describe China's nuclear weapons policy. So the other three framings don't seem to conduce much to nuclear restraint. And indeed, they may be worryingly mutually reinforcing in helping drive the current buildup to the degree that they're influenced by China's posture is influenced by game theoretical positioning, net power aggregation, or great power status seeking, or some combination of the three. All these influences would seem to point in the direction of more nuclear weapons expansion rather than less. So I do fear that this raises obviously worrying implications. And as I suggested at the end of my NIP paper, historically minded observers might be forgiven for seeing here some potential echoes of the status-obsessed, militaristic, belligerent, and geopolitically revisionist Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. And of course, that story of destabilizing ambition did not end very well for anybody. So I hope we handle modern China rather better than the world handled Wilhelmine Germany, but the jury is still out. At the very least, I think it's safe to say that China's ambitions are certainly creating some very dangerous clouds on the geopolitical horizon, which is one of the reasons why I'm so pleased that we can get together at events like this and talk about these challenges and what perhaps to try to do about them. So that's my 2 cents worth. Oh, it was more than 2 cents, but I appreciate the chance to offer some perspectives and summarize my NIP paper. And I look forward to hearing your all's perspectives on this terrific group.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much, Chris. I have two questions. You raised this in your talk at NIP about a week ago, and you said China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, you called the Dark Quad, can cooperate deliberately, randomly, or by chance. They just happen to attack U.S. interests simultaneously, but they didn't plan it. Or they could have a formal alliance. Or they could, time to time, get together and do things that are in their mutual interest. But you raised a point, and I'm going to ask you this question. Is it therefore not a threat if there's not a formal alliance among the four as NATO is? That's my first question. Because it's often used as a reason, don't have to worry about it because there's not a formal alliance.
That is not a reason at all, in my view. I actually think a formal alliance is quite unlikely for a variety of reasons that have to do more with the sort of the politics and psychology of the four Dark Quad members in question. I'm actually intrigued that Russia and North Korea have been talking as openly about almost a formalized relationship as they have. But I don't see it as being very likely that China's never felt comfortable in that kind of an alliance. They had an alliance, a formalized alliance of sorts with the Soviets back in the day, and it clearly didn't sit very well in Beijing. I don't see a formal alliance as being very likely, but that is no answer to that. That is certainly no reason not to fear what may happen as a result of their close cooperation. They share lots of interests. Well, okay, let me say this. They have lots of divergent interests, but they share at the moment an overriding interest, in effect, in messing with us, right? They all share an interest in undermining the current rules-based international system, and certainly of breaking the United States' global role and status and power and our influence in shoring up that system that has been so important in protecting the sovereign autonomy of independent states all over the place, right? So they share that interest overwhelmingly, notwithstanding all their other many differences between them. I firmly am convinced that one of these days the wheels are going to fall off of the Sino-Russian collaboration because historically that's never worked for them. They have a lot of reasons to be bitter enemies and rivals. They sit next to each other in all kinds of awkward and problematic ways. And that's not going to last too long, but it will last for a while. And the really dangerous part is what happens between now and then, right? I mean, even if eventually that's not a problem because they end up being preoccupied with each other once again, as they have been for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, we have a major challenge over the coming decades before that happens. And I am in no way worried about a formal alliance, and I am extremely worried about possibilities for, as I said in my remarks, either opportunistic cooperation or more deliberately planned cooperation. And it certainly does not have to rise to the level of an alliance in a formal sense for that to present huge problems. Already our planners worry about the possibility of one of them. Let's say we get into a tiff with one of them, the other might decide, oh, this is a great chance for me to grab what I want while the big bad Americans are distracted over here by this other guy. That is a huge problem that we already worry about a lot. I and a number of other people, this is certainly not just my idea, worry also about at least the theoretical possibility of planned collaboration. In other words, not just the, oh, this is a great opportunity, I'm going to take advantage of it, but let's get together and figure out how we can, in a coordinated way, confront the Americans with maximal strategic problems at the same time. That is not a zero chance, and it is a huge, huge potential problem for us.
Thank you, Chris. My second question is, Tom Reed's book, The Nuclear Express. In that book, he had a chapter on China's role in proliferation of nuclear weapons technology. And he said in 1982, Deng Xiaoping made a formal proposal to the Politburo, which was accepted, to proliferate nuclear weapons technology, particularly to Pakistan, which eventually, through the Khan network, got nuclear weapons technology to Iran, North Korea, Libya, and I'm probably the only person that I think it also ended up indirectly in Libya. I mean, in Iraq. Why is there there's almost no discussion of that policy anywhere in the literature? Then it was secret, but now it's come out. You have almost no discussion of this issue. Why is that?
Well, the honest answer is I'm not sure why there's so little discussion of it. I mean, those are these days fairly well understood background facts. And you mentioned, I mean, I myself was involved back when I was my first tour at the State Department. We were very fortunate in the bureau in which I worked. We had a sort of the coordinating role of the overt side of helping dismantle the Libyan WMD program after Gaddafi was, shall we say, intimidated into renouncing his WMD program. And the little group that I was with, we actually left Libya with the Chinese nuclear weapons designs that AQ Khan had given to Muammar Gaddafi and flew them back to Washington for analysis. I've seen the darn thing. So yes, as Reed points out in the Nuclear Express, I think it was Reed and I want to say Stillman maybe, but as they point out in that book, there was, I think they used the phrase, they describe a particular nuclear weapons design as China's export model, and that's pretty much the case. Maybe we don't talk about it so much nowadays in Washington because the U.S. spent a lot of time and energy diplomatically in the 1990s, in connection with China's joining the NPT, in trying to persuade China to stop that sort of stuff, which of course would have been a massive violation of the NPT, of Article 1 of the NPT. And I mean, at least in terms of China's involvement, maybe most of it did. They've been much more active in recent years, since then, in proliferating missile technology than in nuclear technology per se. So arguably, U.S. officials may have gone quiet on the topic in a sense, in a way, to thank China for showing at least a modest degree of restraint in the 1990s on this. But it's just speculative. I don't know. We need to be very honest about China's role in creating the modern world of nuclear proliferation challenges, whether or not it is currently doing so. The Chinese Communist Party claims continuity. This is not a system in which you can say, oh, well, that was a Deng Xiaoping thing. Don't worry about it. It's not my fault. This is they had a collective leadership, both in theory and to a great degree in practice over most of this time, and they need to take some collective responsibility for it too.
Chris, our president, Jim Petrosky, has a question for you.
Yeah, I'll go on voice here, but basically, I try to look at everything from the standpoint of what could be prevented, what was not, and you sort of covered a lot of this. China's being opportunistic, or this was inevitable to happen, and that gives us the ability to go back and look at how we may have prevented us being in a situation where we're seeing a fairly unstoppable advancement of nuclear work being done in China. Can you comment on that, sort of go a little bit deeper on what might have happened or could have happened, just as a historical perspective?
I mean, sure, with, of course, the caveat, this is just my, speculation. But I suspect that there probably, I mean, if my theory of the case is correct, there probably was never really a way to dissuade or deter China from having these ambitions. It always probably wanted to be the first and foremost power in the world, and that would necessarily have to include, in a nuclear era, would necessarily have to include the first and foremost nuclear weapons arsenal. But that's the desire, that's the demand signal. How they act in practice, at least historically, has occasionally been quite strategically pragmatic. They may have always wanted that, but they, at least for a while, under Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successors, were willing to postpone, vindicating those, acting on those desires, because it was strategically unwise to do that. Right? Had they begun this kind of a buildup in the 1990s, who knows what would have happened? The early 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, and we're the hyperpower, the unipolars, sort of world policeman sort of thing. I don't know what would have happened then, but it would have been a very different world. So they clearly know how to exercise strategic restraint when they're confronted with circumstances that show clearly that taking a particular course of action, at least at the moment, is a bad idea. So had we been more attentive and effective in our deterrent policies and taken Chinese threats seriously, instead of imagining that we could make them into the so-called responsible stakeholder by wrapping our arms around them and helping them to acquire the technology and the wealth and power that they wanted. If we'd taken a different approach some years ago, I don't think we would have dissuaded them from having those overall ambitions, but it's at least conceivable that we would have prolonged the period in which they would look at the strategic environment and say, like, oh goodness, this is not a good time for that kind of a buildup. So, this is the old joke about what do you say to the god of death? The answer, we're all going to die maybe, but you tell the god of death not today. And if you can have him, this is what we tell them, and we try to encourage them to think about Taiwan too. Like, today is not the day. And if you can have tomorrow be not the day also, and the day after that, you're actually making progress. So I suspect that at least it's possible with a more robust deterrent strategy and a more, realistic appraisal of China's threats and strategic ambitions, we may have been able to keep them in, for perhaps a much longer period of time, keep them in the position of thinking that, gosh, maybe this is not the right time to have a nuclear buildup vis-a-vis the US. We'll wait another few years. And if you can keep them waiting another few years, you've actually done something. We clearly failed.
Thank you, Chris. We have a colleague who always asks very provocative questions, and this is one. He says, given your reference to how we handled or didn't handle Germany's rise in both World War I and World War II, here's the question I'm going to quote. Shouldn't the West simply get over the fact that China or the CCP are absolutely determined to restore China's former dominance on world affairs before the rise of the age of the West, and that they will do so at any cost, including the annihilation of the West? That's the end of the quote. Let me caveat the question and point out, I think a lot of people do not believe that China is that determined. That is, as the head of the dean of a graduate school in international affairs told me at a StrapCon conference, is that China is Burger King and we're McDonald's. Get over the fact that they're trying to make a better hamburger. And that I think is unfortunately a very dominant thinking among either Wall Street or academics. But take it away, Chris.
Well, I mean, I guess to some degree it follows from my remarks a moment ago that I think we need to understand that they probably are, for all functional purposes, they're irrevocably committed to this path. But as I also suggested, they've also shown that they're capable of being restrained in their timing. I would be perfectly happy to confront them with circumstances in which, for the indefinite future, they still feel it to be an unwise decision to get into a nuclear arms race with the United States. Clearly, that's not the impression that we've given them. Indeed, I fear that we may have signaled quite the contrary. I mean, it's not just a question of what their underlying ambitions are. It's a question of how those ambitions map against their assessment of the kind of pushback they're likely to get. And, for example, in the specifically nuclear realm alone, we have, in effect, I fear, sent a signal over many, many years now in the post-Cold War era that we are so neuralgic about the idea of building new nuclear weapons, and we are so uncomfortable with the whole nuclear business. We have let our nuclear production infrastructure, shrink and atrophy. I mean, we've done some heroic science to, in effect, make our, old Cold War era nuclear weapons designs themselves, sort of functionally immortal, trying to keep them from, deteriorating and being unreliable without nuclear testing. And that's been good, I guess. But in terms of our ability to do new things, to produce new weapons, to produce numbers of weapons, we've allowed all of that to shrink to the point of dangerous decrepitude. And we've only very recently begun to try to turn that around. And it's been a very painful and halting and slow and ineffective process thus far. So we've sort of kind of sent the signal to them with respect to our capacity to engage in a our own nuclear buildup. We've sort of kind of signaled to them that, gosh, a nuclear arms race with the United States is something that we might be able to win. And when you send a signal like that to an adversary who has long-term strategic ambitions, you're going to make a very difficult, it is going to be very hard to say to them there that, but this is not the day, right? So maybe by a more robust posture, we could have deterred their taking this step for some considerable period of time further, maybe indefinitely. But that's not the course that we chose. And now we have the awkward and I fear expensive and challenging business ahead of us of trying to restore that kind of deterrent signaling and make it clear to them that, by the way, guys, this really wasn't the good idea you thought it was going to be, and maybe you need to be a bit more restrained looking forward. I don't know if we're going to pull that off, but that I think is the strategic game in which we are very much engaged these days.
Thank you, Chris. I have a follow-up is, have you seen John Lankowski's essay on how we should deal with China?
Probably not, to my embarrassment,
Okay.
but
It's a very lengthy piece on using an all-of-government approach. But my question is, if you were sitting down with either members of Congress, House and Senate, or the administration, and they said, okay, what do we do? How do we deter China so, as the Israelis say, just cut the lawn every week and keep it from getting into 10 feet high, and that's basically what you can do. As you say, put it off till tomorrow, whatever you're thinking of doing. Paul Mitzi always told me, he said, I want the Russian general officers to sit around their computers thinking about attacking us and conclude at the end of every day, not today, comrade. So if you would follow up on that.
goodness, yeah, not today, comrade, is indeed the objective. Well, gosh, any number of things that we probably should be doing, some of which we're starting to do to a degree, and some of which we probably haven't yet started. But I guess, since you mentioned that the challenge or the need for and the challenge of a whole of government approach, that's maybe one place to start, in the sense that we're in a very different situation than the PRC is when it comes to how it is that one organizes a whole of government answer to things. In their system, although it's incredibly complicated and bureaucratic, in theory, this is a very simple proposition, right? I mean, you have essentially a command direction that gives guidance that one should invest money in the following high technology areas, and one should build this and do that. And with hiccups and bumps and fits and starts, as any big organization, more or less, that is what the system in China is designed, in fact, to be responsive to. Now, those aren't tools, and those are not authorities that we want American leaders to have, right? It would be appalling if our leaders in a free democracy had those kinds of coercive and system-wide tools of direction and coercion. So we rule out giving our leaders the ability to decree a whole of government approach like that. So what are we left with? We know what a whole of government strategy a la chinoise means. We need to figure out what a strategy a l'américaine means. And it seems to me that one of the things that it has to mean, has to start with at least, is a lot of real clarity and guidance and honesty from all participants here. Because our leaders can't direct, the president cannot direct the U.S. private sector to bring the fruits of private sector technology development in to support our deterrence policy. You can do a lot. You can buy things, you can encourage things, but at the end of the day, our system works fundamentally, really heavily on the basis of elicitation of persuaded collaboration. We need to be building public-private partnerships, and you can only do that around a narrative that makes very clear that this is absolutely essential. The kind of narrative that motivated Americans back in the wake, after the Sputnik launch in 1957, for example, or in various points during the Cold War. We need to have a lot of clarity from the top and clear articulation of the needs and the challenges of this era, and how we can and should and must work together to do it. And it's only beginning with that kind of a honest, clear, and compelling narrative that you'll actually be able to get the kind of broad public and private collaboration that you need in order to make an American-style free democratic system respond in a whole of government kind of way. So we've got a lot to do in hearing from our political leaders and making that case as compellingly as they need to. But that's perhaps the agenda for the years ahead.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to turn it back over to our president, Jim Petrovsky. We have a few minutes left to see if he has any follow-up questions that he'd like to ask.
Well, actually, I don't have any follow-up questions, but I will say for our audience, I really appreciate the back and forth. And I think this is a great opportunity to hear from an expert in this area and get background on how people are thinking about this very complex problem. And I'm sure it's going to unfold for quite some time. I'll also say your collection of swords in the background really adds to your acumen here, Chris. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who runs these, unless there's any last minute questions. I went through the chat and didn't see anything else there. I always think that this seminar that Peter Huessy has been running for many years is a special opportunity for people to get one-on-one view from the expertise who've been thinking about these problems and just wonder what's happening here. So Peter, as always, I thank your background in this, bringing in these expert speakers to our speakers, always to our audience. We want to remind you to think deterrence, and I'm going to turn it back to Alex to tell you about what's coming up. Alex, go ahead.
If you don't mind me interrupting, I just say you mentioned earlier that Peter's been doing these for 40 years, I think you said. I was thinking about this coming into this event, like, gosh, I've been doing these things with Peter off and on for about 20 years. And I was thinking, gosh, that's a long time. And I realized what a newbie I am. It's fantastic stuff. Congratulations.
Yeah, we're very proud to have Peter as part of our organization. So,
Jim, let me just, if I could interject briefly, the power went out here at Potomac because of the windstorm, but then I came back. I apologize for that. But Steve Blank, who was a NIDS senior fellow, as I am, we wrote an essay today at Gatestone. The reason that's important is Dr. Zellico wrote a very lengthy piece for a Texas Quarterly saying that, yes, you can improve the deterrent, you can modernize, but it won't be done probably for 10 years, probably more. And what happens in the meantime? And that's the essence of our essay, which is United States defense modernization when we miss the boat, meaning it will occur and be completed after we get into a conflict with one of these bad guys, what you call the dark quad, because their calendar isn't our calendar. They may decide to do something long before we're ready to deter it. And I think it's in Gatestone Institute. They published it this morning. I just want to bring that on because Steve is a partner with us with NIDS, wonderful expert on Russia. And so, Alex, sorry about that, but over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Peter. And Chris, that was awesome. So for our audience, Dr. Ford here, he has a book called The Mind of Empire, China's History and Modern Foreign Relations. That's not his only book, but that's one of his many books. And that book, this Mind of Empire, is available on Kindle, Amazon as a hardcover, and also it's available as an audiobook on Audible for those who would like to learn more of this research. And for our upcoming seminars, we have on August 16, we have at 10 a.m., we have Towards Deterrence Strategy 3.0 with Brad Roberts. And then on August 23, 10 a.m., Dynamic Parity. This is with our very own NIDS Vice Presidents, Adam Lowther and Curtis McGiffin. So we hope to see you here for both of those Fridays. So next Friday and the one following, we will still have things going on here. So make this a routine for your Fridays when we're available. We are happy to always have these discussions. And as Dr. Ford said, we want to let them say today is not the day, and just keep this thing going, keep these seminars going for years to come. So we know that we're still, for lack of a better word, kicking this can down the road, and hopefully can kick it till it never has to happen.
Yes,
Thanks,
and Chris,
everybody.
thank you was honored to have you speak. Enjoyed your remarks as always. And yes, you've been doing this for 20 years. Let's look forward to 20 more.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.